Go.
Hi, David.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are David Frum. And you are, well, first of all, you're David Frum, widely known conservative intellectual, although there's some dispute in some conservative circles.
Whether I count as an intellectual, I know.
No, it's not the intellectual part that bothers them, I think. It's the conservative part.
Yes.
But we will get to that because I think it's not totally unrelated to the main subject of our discussion, which is your new novel.
Right. Here I am. I'm holding it up right now.
You're not the only one. You're not the only one, David.
Excellent. Actually, I'm holding up the uncorrected proof, so let me put that down. That's not what people want. They want the book.
No, they want this, which I assume is corrected. Much discussed, hotly debated, widely enjoyed novel Patriots. This is a first for you, I take it, writing a novel?
Yes. No, I'm not one of those people who's got like short stories in the drawer left over from when they were 17.
So it's not a long-standing aspiration of yours to be a...
It's not a long-standing aspiration. It was something I started thinking about a couple of years ago. I had this character in my head, and I had the first line of a book in my head. And then I didn't really know what to do with it. And
that would be Walter Schotsky, the mustard heir?
Right. That's this feckless, aimless 28-year-old heir to big fortune. And I had the first line. I didn't get the job through merit, my girlfriend said, but then I didn't get my girlfriend through merit either. But I didn't know what I was going to do beyond that. And then over the past couple of years, as I was going through a lot of my own intellectual changes, the story of the book and the message and purpose of the book became clear in my mind. I wanted to tell people something about what this city looked like to somebody who saw it the way I did.
Mm-hmm. And it's not altogether a pretty picture, is it, David?
It's a pretty horrible picture. I mean, the novel tries to be a funny book. I'm a big believer in telling stories through comedy. But it's a grim picture. I mean, look.
I got to say, I think you do a good job with the humor. I mean, in the aforementioned opening passage, the line I like is, he describes having met this girlfriend. She says, "What's your name?" He says, "Walter." "Walter what?" He says, "Walter Schotsky." And she says, "Like the mustard?" He says, "Yes, that's right." And she says, "Kind of funny to be named after a mustard." And he says, "The mustard's named after me." That's a great line, and apparently it's not the first time he had used it.
Exactly. That's how he's scored girls all through his life up to that point.
But enough frivolity. Let's get back to this ugly side of Washington. There are specific things you wanted to call attention to that you're not happy with about the way Washington runs and the kind of people who run it, right?
Well, the background thing that I have haunting me through all of this is you come to Washington, try to get a dinner reservation here on a Thursday night. And yet we live through a time of economic calamity. I mean, it makes me think, when I was a boy, I'd go to the library, I'd pull out a book, and it would have a copyright 1934, 35. And you think, what was going on outside that author's window? I mean, he must have, whatever he's writing about, Byzantine coinage, whatever, he must have been haunted by that overwhelming economic fact. And yet, we've lived through something, it's not like the Great Depression, but it's as close as we'll ever see, worst thing since it. And it's made remarkably little impact on the city, and it's made remarkably little impact on politics, and especially on the politics of my side, which has just been conducted without reference to this overwhelming national catastrophe, and it haunts me.
And you think it's not just that Washington is famously recession-proof because it's so dependent on government spending for its livelihood.
Yeah. Well, the people in this book, I mean, Washington, it was one thing to say in 1971. Washington's recession-proof. The economy goes into a downturn, but the government keeps paying salaries, and all those people at Department of Mines continue to collect their paycheck, and they continue to buy shoes for their kids and go bowling. This is not like that. I mean, this is a book in which the central characters are plutocrats. They've acquired vast fortunes, and it's not just about a steady paycheck. It is about a system in which huge sums of money flow into the center, and in which power and wealth become ever more closely connected.
Okay. You think this is new? You've seen it change in your lifetime?
Oh, yeah. I'm not the first person to point this out, that this has become suddenly a city in which there are rich people, and very rich people. That is different. But I think what is truly new is the disconnect, the ability of the political system to operate with hardly any reference to this economic crisis at all. And the story of the book is set in a kind of alternative future. And I mean, it's the first black president has just lost re-election, but the black president is not Barack Obama, and there's a chronic war going on, but in Mexico, and
9/11 never happened in this world, right?
9/11, and one of the readers of the book made astutely said, and this is quite shrewd, I left that out partly to clear the stage, also because there's always a problem when you write a novel that people think you're writing your own story, and because I had a very big part in the 9/11 story, that if I write about that, then people say, well, what about you? What about Axis of Evil? And I want all of that off the stage. And I wanted to focus on, what is happening now that I'm observing, not that I was any kind of small participant.
For anyone who may not know, you were a speechwriter for Bush in the aftermath of 9/11.
Right. And somebody who has a much exaggerated role in recent history. So I wanted all that off the stage, and I wanted to show. There's this new president elected, and he comes. He's a war hero. He's got a vision he's been selected by the more conservative party, which is not doing so well. They need a hero. They need somebody to defeat this incumbent, and they trust the man to be dominated by them. Grover Norquist at CPAC this year said of Mitt Romney that all we ask for of a nominee is that he have 5 fingers and a thumb so he can sign bills. That's what they think. That's what the Constitutionalist Party in this book thinks it has found in my President Pulaski. Only it turns out he's got ideas of his own. And as those emerge, the Constitutionalist Party erupts in mutiny against this president they've elected. And we get a kind of insurrection that's got a lot of points of similarity to the Tea Party. And we see how you put together an insurrection like that. Okay.
So, speaking of the Tea Party, I mean, there are things you're commenting on beyond the concentration of, this new affluence of Washington.
Right. Well, one of the central institutions in the book is a cable news network called Patriot News. And we see Walter kind of unwisely, inadvertently has an affair with the mistress of the head of Patriot News, and get sort of a view of how Patriot News is Facebook for old people. It is a way in which people feel alienated from America connect. It's social media, and it's a network that's conducted with self-conscious disregard for what is true. And at one point, the mistress tells Walter, that the creator of this thing, doesn't believe in reality. He makes reality. And Walter says, you mean like most CEOs think they are God, but he actually is God.
Now, are readers who connect Patriot News to Fox News overreaching, David?
There are a lot of points of similarity. Patriot News is an even huger presence in the book than Fox News is in American life, and the figure at the top of Patriot News is not Rupert Murdoch, not Roger Ailes. He's got little bits of each of their personality mixed in with the personality of another really vicious CEO, and they're all sort of jumbled together. I mean, it's not a roman à clay. It's not one person equals one character, that everybody is recombined. But there are lots of elements that are familiar, and there are lots of small ones. I mean, there are a lot of sort of like gargoyles, inside jokes, based on, again, things that I've seen over the years here in Washington.
So you deny a one-to-one correspondence between your characters and real-life characters?
It's not just deny. They have. There is usually 1 or 2 people at least, and often 3 or 4, and large parts of it that are just invented, or large parts things that are important about an actual person that are omitted from the character that has reference to that real life person.
Okay, so back to Patriot News. I mean, one of the themes in the book is an atmosphere of extreme partisanship. I mean, this is a much discussed thing about the real Washington, and it's something you've gotten very concerned about in real life, I take it.
Yeah. Well, and you see also how, at one point, Walter's mentor, who's the last of the moderate constitutionalists, a senator from Rhode Island, whose career is at an end.
The constitutionalists are the party; they kind of stand-ins for the Republican Party.
They stand in for the Republicans, although they're not exactly the same. But this mentor of Walter's is explaining to Walter why Walter needs to be more of a partisan than the mentor was. It's just not possible to have a kind of career like the mentor had. And he's explained, there are sides, and these things are enforced. And Walter says, isn't that kind of stupid? And the mentor says, of course it's stupid. That's why it has to be enforced so strictly.
And that's one of the main absurdities of real life that you're
right.
That you're highlighting.
And but you see it happen. I mean, what you see here is how much of this. There are sort of two main villains in the book, and one is a genuine extremist, and the other is a charlatan, and who pretends to be an extremist for personal advantage. And one of the things that I invite you to think about is which of those is worse. Is it and
right. So a blind ideologue versus a career partisan, kind of.
Well. One of them is a blind ideologue who becomes an enforcer and a goon, and his signature line is, when he's threatening people, he says, have you ever considered that the purpose of your life may be to serve as a negative example for others? And the other is a character who appears out of nowhere, and he purports to be a kind of social scientist, and he's got all kinds of data, only it's all made up, and it's uncheckable by anybody else. And the question is, well, what's driving him? And there are sort of hints about where he comes from and how his career has been constructed off stage before we see the beginning of the story by others. But his motives are pretty clearly self-interested. One is sincere and the other is not sincere. And you have to decide for yourself. I mean, there are a lot of points in the book where there are conversations about which of the ways of looking at something are true. That's one of the things that's interesting about fiction. You don't have the definitive answer. But in this case, I invite you, which of these guys do you dislike more?
Well, and also, I mean, kind of who's controlling whom, right?
Yes.
I mean, in a world where you have a symbiotic relationship between intense ideologues on the one hand and people who are, let's say, more flexible in their beliefs, but are willing to identify with the ideologues for purposes of self-advancement. I guess there are two questions. Which is worse, if either, and kind of who's in charge here?
Well, that's a question that we are invited through the book to brood about. So Walter at one point thinks about a story he heard about as a kid about these tiny little birds that nest inside the mouths of crocodiles, supposedly, and clean their teeth. And the question is, who's working for who? Are the crocodiles working for the birds, or are the birds working for the crocodiles? And it depends on your point of view. But at the end, this whole mutiny against the president is called off because the cynics overrule the ideologues. We don't know that they will always be able to do that, but in this story, at the crucial moment, the president is broken, and he surrenders to Washington. And at that point, the cynics prevail. And Walter, of course, through all of this, has been rising and rising and rising and becoming a kind of hero and a huge success because of his own negative qualities. And the book ends with, basically the villains rise and are promoted. The good people mostly retire from the scene. The president, who's a kind of an admirable person, maybe too ruthless for a democratic system, is broken. And Walter, of course, is going to go on to huge success.
Now, so there are some things that cynics... Some links to which cynics will not go in following ideologues.
Well, they're not going to, not when it gets expensive, and not when they get their way. And at one point, one of the ideological characters says kind of bitterly, I always thought we'd get more done before we became completely corrupt. Which is, by the way, a line I didn't invent. That's a line that was said to me in a conversation about the Republican Congress by a very important conservative political... I've been keeping some notes on these things, and I use some of... the book also is kind of... has a quality as a museum of stories and lines that I've heard from people over the years that otherwise would be lost to the winds.
Okay, so you don't identify specific characters with real-life people, but are there real-life people you'd be willing to talk about who exemplify these two categories of people, the intense ideologue on the one hand and the kind of cynical partisan on the other?
Yeah. Well, the cynical, look, I mean, we all see them. We all know these types. They're all around us. There's one last thing I want to mention about this as sort of a...
But you're not going to tell us that... For those of us who can't think of any names at the moment, you're not going to help us out.
Well, I'm not... look, there's a host of a show at 5 o'clock on Patriot News who's a super inflammatory person. His name is Mark Dunn, and there's a pretty obvious basis in Glenn Beck in that person. But I don't want to present this thing as a kind of roman à clef where there's a decoder ring. I'm really not asking for correspondences between characters in the book and people in real life, but you are clearly talking about real themes in real life, including this particular one, and surely there are people who exemplify those for sure.
themes.
For sure. And, I think there's a character named Elmer Larson who runs a group for Americans for Entrepreneurship, and people will see, he's got some points of similarity with Grover Norquist. There are radio talks. There's a radio talk show host, who's very proud of being the first to have called the outgoing president a Marxist and a communist on the radio, and he's just a wild character. And I think people will see some points of similarity between him and, he's a combination of Mark Levin and Michael Savage and others like that. But there's also, in order to make some points, you do a little bit of exaggeration. So, for example, Walter's got a girlfriend who's much cleverer than he is, and her parents are kind of aghast at the relationship because they brought her up to, she's beautiful, she's smart, she could do anything. They said, we raised you to believe that you could run the world, but she comes from a very, very middle-class family. She herself went to Penn State, Walter went to Brown, and she's got a very grim view of the possibilities of life for middle-class people. And she has a job beneath her abilities. She's working as an assistant at a party planning operation in Washington. And she says at one point to her mother, I'm not going to run the world. I'm lucky, I'm grateful to be giving the parties for the people who are going to be running the world. And she's with Walter, and she comes to be very fond of Walter, but she's mostly with him because it's only that way that she has any chance of rising into the place in American society that once somebody's talents could have taken. Now I'm exaggerating. There is still upward mobility in America, and smart middle-class people do rise into the American elite. Not the way they used to, but they still do. So I've overstated that in order to, through this character. But because I think it's happened, that deterioration has happened. We're still in the course of that degradation. It's not as, what's happened to the middle is not as visible to our eyes as what's happened to the bottom. And so if you're going to make people think about what's happened to the middle and the person of this girl, you have to exaggerate a little bit. And that's another thing you can do in fiction that you can't do in journalism. Can't legitimately do in journalism.
So you're saying one thing that's happening that I assume is, I don't know, is it related to rising income inequality, is the demise of meritocracy in the old-fashioned sense, you're saying?
What we're seeing in this book is the coagulation of a kind of American oligarchy, and that the people who run the system become more and more powerful. And as they do, as wealth and power merge, obviously they're going to protect that for their progeny. And they're going to make sure that the circle, as the circle gets smaller and smaller, the people who are already in it want to keep their relatives in it. And that doesn't leave much room for anybody new to join.
But isn't the latest, insurgent force that's become arguably powerful the Tea Party? Those aren't blue bloods, right?
No,
aren't they nouveau powerful?
Well, out here in America, in real life, we can have our debate about how powerful is the Tea Party really.
Right.
And the Tea Party was powerful for a time, and it succeeded in having an impact on the 2010 congressional races. And then you have to make your own assessment of what you think the Tea Party was, what the people who went to those rallies were protesting for. And so then this is another reason why I've done this as stories. I have some intuitions about it that if I were writing journalism, it would be kind of hard for me to prove that a big part of the Tea Party is a nostalgia for an America that a lot of people who are now in their 60s, who are very middle class, remember as better for people like them 20 and 30 years ago. Now, how do I go prove that? I can't, but I can tell a story in which you can see that one of the people who comes out to this protest is an older guy, like late 50s, and he's worried about his kids. And his father was a unionized worker who rose to be a supervisor, and they're still living in the same house. And he's got his father's old pay stubs, and he realizes his father was making more as a factory supervisor, in not adjusting for inflation, just in terms of pay stubs, than his son is working as a so-called assistant manager of a Starbucks, but really, glorified barista. And that they've lost something, and they want their country back. What was America? America was the promise that things could be better for the ordinary person. That's the thing that's not there. I mean, the rocks and streams are all still here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now here's a kind of an irony, I think, maybe in your worldview, which is that as you put it like this, the book almost sounds populist. It's an indictment of the ruling class, and yet I've in the past taken your indictment of elites to be an elitist indictment, in the sense that you do believe, along with people like Walter Lippmann, that elites should take a leading role in guiding opinion in a democracy, right?
Yeah. Well, they inevitably will. They inevitably will.
Okay, but there are people who have the opposite view that really one person, one vote in the purest sense and influence should be equally distributed among everyone. Trust the people. You do have this view that elites have a special mission. Particularly well-educated people who have time to reflect on things have a mission, and I think that one thing that bothers you, it's not so much the concentration of influence as the way they are betraying the mission and betraying the trust that would be put in them in a system in which elites lead.
Thank you. That's better said than I've said it. I'm not a. I mean, when you said at the beginning, you asked me, do I still consider myself a conservative? I mean, one of the ways that I am a conservative in the way I think about society, I think talents aren't equally distributed. I think elitism is it's not a norm; it's a description of how societies organize themselves. And then the question in a democratic society, elites justify themselves through service. To the extent they do a good job and deliver for people, then those are positive elites. And one of the things that the book is a lament for is the demise of the responsible elite. The book's clearest hero is this senator who's a mentor to Walter, who exemplifies that. And let's not get carried away. He acknowledges he has to do a lot of things he doesn't like, and because those are the rules, and he can't control the rules. And he's going to be. And he's leaving the stage. He's going to be replaced by somebody like Walter, who's a lot less admirable and impressive and interesting. But at least Walter has internalized some of the ethic of being a responsible member of an elite at a time when everybody around him says, we're not elites, we're not members of an elite, we're oligarchs. We're going to use this system for our own benefit without reference to what's going on anywhere else. And that has that's our political life, and it makes me very angry.
Now, what about a Dick Lugar? I mean, first of all, do you consider him an example of an elite who was fulfilling his mission? A, but then B, what about the way he was displaced? Yeah. It wasn't a plutocrat. Again, it gets back to this kind of Tea Party insurgency. I mean, how does Lugar figure into your paradigm?
Well, Lugar is somebody who's trying to be an old-fashioned kind of. He's a conservative person, and I think Jeffrey Kavasov said a very good piece about him in the New Republic. It would be wrong to describe Lugar as a moderate. That he was somebody who believed that the Senate should work as a kind of consensual body, and that it was a job, that if a Democratic president nominated judges, you didn't have to like them. You just voted to confirm them unless there's something wrong with them, because you expected when there was a Republican president that your counterparts would do the same. And there was enough sense of institutional spirit to say, well, we need somebody to be Secretary of Defense, and if a Republican president wins the election, it's going to be a Republican who's Secretary of Defense. We can't paralyze the system in that way. Now, he's gone, and he's gone by somebody who made it he's at the hands of someone who made a very explicit point of saying this game has to be played more ruthlessly and with less compromise. And I look at this and I think that the only possible democratic response to that is to say, okay, and we'll play ruthlessly. Walter, at one point in this book, runs into an old friend of his who worked for the previous president, who's no longer, won't be Walter's friend anymore. And Walter's very hurt by this. But this guy explains to him, I'm going to play the game. Walter, you've just shown up here at the last minute. You don't know what's going on. But I am going to play the game the way you people play it, because otherwise I'm a victim. And you get a cable news network to tell lies about me. I'll get a cable news network to tell lies about you. You raise illegal campaign contributions. I'll raise illegal campaign contributions. And the logic of the Murdoch challenge to Lucre is that Democrats have to play this game in the same way. And, at one point somebody says to Walter, actually Elmer Larson, the ideologue, says to him, the rules are, there are no two ways about it. We win. There are only two outcomes. We win, they lose, or they win, we lose. And Walter says, well, there is a third possibility, which is we both lose.
Right. Which seems to be happening. There's another, I don't know if it's an irony or what, but I think some people would say, you're identifying the plutocracy as partly culpable in this demise of the responsible elite. Some people would put it the other way. I think they'd say the old-fashioned plutocrats had a sense of noblesse oblige, the Roosevelts, the Rockefellers, that allowed them to govern with relative disinterest. The fact they didn't need more money helped them govern with relative disinterest. And in any event, this idea of an obligation of service was kind of bred into them, right? But you're telling a very different story.
Plus, I look back on it. I think one of the things that was different. There are two major things different in those years after the war. It was 30 years after the war, maybe three. Thing number one was, as you said, that the people who were the leading figures in the American economy then were products of an educational system that was, in fact, that had this kind of muscular Christianity to it, where they were stamped with the idea of service, and it might be hypocritical, but that line, the famous line of John F. Kennedy's about "Ask not what your country can do for you," that was based on the standard entrance lecture that was given at Groton, I think, one of the prep schools. Ask not what you can do for. Ask not what Groton can do for you. Ask what you can do for Groton.
Is that right?
Yeah, Endicott Peabody, appararily.
I thought that was a Ted Sorensen coinage. But no.
Speechwriters only steal. They never coin.
Yeah, like good artists or great artists.
Then there's always a lot of hypocrisy about that. But the things that people say do influence their behavior. It's not a perfect relationship, but they do. So that's one difference. The second was the memory of the Great Depression, in which so many people had nearly been ruined. Whereas this recent depression, the truly wealthy were at risk for a period of maybe 6 months. And it was not a formative experience. And they never had to worry about social revolution. Whereas for the people who lived through the 30s, it was horrible for about 4 years. The wealthy began to recover after about 1933. The rest of the society took a while to catch up. But they they worried all through the 30s about social revolution. And the need to preserve consent was something that was very influencing on them. And then finally, there's always a lot of money sloshing around the system in those years after the war. The sense of competition for resources was not as acute in the 1950s, 60s, and even into the 70s as it is now. We are, we feel. I don't know. I shouldn't say we are. I can't see the future, but many of us feel that we are into a future where we're all going to be disappointed to one degree or another. The tax rates will not stay where they are. Medicare won't stay as generous as it is. Other social programs will shrink. And the only question is going to be who gets how much less, who will be disappointed to what degree. And in such a situation, people are much more protective of what they currently have than of what they hope to have. And the best organized and the toughest will hold most.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that is, I'm afraid I don't belong to that group.
Well, once you're over 55, I think. Not to be invidious.
Not quite over.
Okay. Well, by the time the
I'm less than a year away from being.
Okay. By the time the Ryan plan is passed, you will be over 55, so you will be protected.
Yes.
You'll be one of the winners. You will get.
Excellent.
You will get Medicare as it exists.
I've always said that Paul Ryan is a fine American.
Right, so that's his deal. That over 55, you lose less than if you are under 55 at the time the plan is passed. And of course, it gets worse for each year under the less you are under 55, the worse the deal you get under that plan. And that's part of putting together a coalition of people who have something, who are organized to defend what they've got.
Yeah. Well, I've always said that generational warfare is an idea whose time is coming. And I think its time has come.
Exactly.
At this moment. Okay, so this conversation would be incomplete if I did not level an accusation against you. And since I don't have one of my own, I'm going to quote from this, let's say, unfriendly review in the Daily Caller. I don't even know who wrote this. I'm sure the name is indelibly embedded in your brain if you're a normal author. But
he's somebody I previously knew. I mean, so
this is somebody. This is a former friend.
Not a friend, but that's somebody I've had conversations with over the past. Yeah.
Okay, you can then choose or not choose to disclose his name. I leave that to you. But the irony here is that this is quoting him. The irony here is that Frum has been living a pampered existence of Georgetown cocktail parties and senior fellow at fill in the blank for so long that for him a major crisis is John Huntsman not being president. Walter Schotsky faces no real crisis. He's only an avatar for Frum to continue his tantrum against the conservative movement that bought his house. And of course, part of the biographical background of this is you were kind of more or less formally declared an apostate by the conservatives. I don't know how you officially describe your departure from the American Enterprise Institute.
Oh, I was sacked.
Yes, that's the term I was groping for.
All right. Well, I would say to that point. First, the author of that particular review acknowledges in sentence 2 that he did not read the book, and I've always thought it showed the highest loyalty to the General Secretary not to read the book that the General Secretary has condemned before you carry out the review, because if the General Secretary doesn't like the book, you don't need to substitute your own judgment for the General Secretary's, and reading the book yourself would only suggest the General Secretary might have got it somehow wrong. But in that accusation, there's a major mistake and a germ of truth, and the major mistake would have been headed off if the person wrote the book, is that Walter Schotsky is in no way to stand in for me, as becomes overwhelmingly. I mean, you don't have to know very much about me, but as it becomes overwhelmingly clear, whoever wrote this book has only a very limited regard for Walter Schotsky.
Well, exactly. No, it's clear that no author would be positing that character as the author.
So if your review is written on the premise that Walter Schotsky is me, you need to read at least another half dozen chapters into it.
No, you're right.
Okay.
That is kind of a facile assertion, I've got to say.
And here's the German, and there's another mistake, and then here's the German. The other mistake is to believe that the conservative movement bought my house. I mean, the truth is, real estate investments in Canada bought my house, and the conservative movement has always been something I've been interested in, but I have other resources. The germ of truth is, it's because I have those other resources. That's right. That's a big part of who I am. I'm a person who's had...
That is the one thing you do have in common with Walter Schotsky.
Yes, I've had a lot of advantages in life, many of them unfair. And the only justification of those is that you use them to buy yourself a little bit of courage. Because, power over man's livelihood is a power over man's mind, as I think Alexander Hamilton said. And so if you are somebody who has a livelihood that people have less power over, then it's your extra obligation not to be pushed around and to say what you think. And that the crazy suggestion, I hear this a lot, the crazy suggestion that I take the views that I've taken over the past 5 years in order to get invited to a party. I can give my own party, and people count. People do count, and I go to more parties than I have time to go to. I'm not even a party guy. But then the suggestion, there's this assertion of control that says because you have lent your time and energy to support a political cause, because you've chosen to focus yourself in one direction rather than giving yourself over to private pursuits, therefore, anything that group of people does forever afterwards, no matter how reckless, you have an obligation to keep quiet about it. I find that very objectionable. And the last thing is to say, anybody who is truly cynical about politics knows, like people who think I don't know how to write the books that would appeal to a conservative audience. One of the things you do when you really learn when you write speeches is you learn how to speak in the voice of others. I could write that book. I could have written that book many times over the past 20 years. I know how to do that. The fact that I haven't done it means I don't think it's worth doing. I don't want to do it. So the suggestion that that there's some kind of that I've somehow departed from that the conservative movement was good to me. The last thing to say is that the person who wrote that, my judge, is unconsciously echoing a famous trade union leader, John Lewis, the head of the CIO, who said to Franklin Roosevelt, when Roosevelt did something he didn't like, it ill behooved somebody who supped at the table of labor to then show political independence. But as I say, that's not what we're here for. We're here to write as we see, and the criteria for judging us who do write for a living is: do we speak the truth? Do we say something useful? Is it good? And if it's not, then throw the tomatoes. But if it is, the fact that I worked at the American Enterprise all this year, I have other. Believe me, it weighs heavier on me that I was there than it weighs on Michael Judge.
Okay. Who is the reviewer in question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, on balance, you treat his review with some skepticism, it seems, and in addition, you accuse him of having violated the first rule of book reviewing, which is never give a bad review to a book you haven't read.
I would say.
I would say that. What about the more? What's that?
Well, I'd say that rule does get violated a lot of the time. This is not a unique offense.
It does. Although I think most reviewers have the good sense to, when they don't have time to actually read the book, take it easy on it.
Or at least not admitted in the second sentence. That's a little reckless.
And keep quiet about it. But what about a much more modest version of the indictment, which is that, let's just say your conviction to write this book was inspired by the falling out you had. Mm-hmm. The sacking at AEI, I'm sure, led to a time of some reflection. Yeah. And I mean, the extreme version of this would be, the accusatory version of this would be, this is a revenge novel. Mm-hmm. And then the less extreme version would be this, grew out of the experience in some less dramatic sense. But is there some connection between your falling out with the conservative establishment and your decision to write the book?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I wouldn't deny that. And it's that kind of reciprocal process, right? I mean, one of the things that happens is you begin to, you feel kind of emancipated to say some things you otherwise would have bitten your tongue over. And look, there are a lot of people in the conservative world who share large elements of the critique I make and who have said so to me. For a variety of reasons, understandable, often praiseworthy, they don't articulate those in public. And that's fine. And so I get...
And just to recapitulate the critique, I gather that the elites, rather than leading the people and guiding the passions of the people, are totally in the thrall of the passions of the people and just cynically harnessing them.
And in order to, and are not making it their first duty to pursue a political system that leads to a wide distribution of benefits. Not an equal distribution of benefits, but everyone should get better off. I mean, the system should work that everybody gets better off. Some people more, some people less, but everybody gets better off. At least everybody who pulls their weight. Everyone who that's 300 million people. There are going to be bad luck stories, but you know what So when I say it, I don't mean literally everybody, but the promise of America, the old promise of American life is maintained. And if it stops, and if you run into an economic crisis where it becomes difficult to maintain that promise, then the governing elite works very hard to rectify the situation as rapidly as possible and doesn't exempt itself entirely either. Also shares in the difficulties of the larger society. And so my critique of the American conservative world is through this crisis, it has not had enough. It's not offered ideas. It's said too many things that aren't true, that don't make sense, and it has not been producing productive solutions. And I'm not unique in that, but yeah, I think it's for sure right that getting sacked from AEI was something that was important to my thinking. I've said, I was pretty mad about it at the time. I mean, in retrospect, I'm not mad about it. In retrospect, it came as something. It feels more and more like a relief. But yeah, that would not be. I don't think I would find it. Let me put it this way: if people think the book is any good, and I'll await their verdict on that, you can't produce something good out of a small motive like that. And if the motive were as small as the one you just hypothesized, then the book would be a crummy little romantic play. And I think it's not.
And why did you decide that fiction was the vehicle? You could make all your critiques in an explicit way, and in fact, you had, I guess, made most of them in an explicit way. But why did you want to do this with a novel?
I think the hope is that you can reach a different kind of audience. You can make people see what you see, and you can also then inspire them. Because in the end, the book ends on a kind of positive note, diminuendo positive note, but it shows, and Walter's going to be a better person and is going to do some of the right things. And what I kind of and I hope the last chapter reads in a reasonably inspiring way, and that somebody may find this book somewhere and read it and think, you know what, I want to be that kind of political figure.
Okay. Say a little something about the publishing model.
Yeah.
It's unconventional. I mean, you trotted out these excerpts in the Huffington Post. You're not making it hard to get a version of the book without paying, right? There is a version you can pay for. I'm holding it.
Yeah. You can. Go ahead. There are about 10 chapters that are there on the Huffington Post, and I think there are another couple of chapters. There's a chapter posted on the Maclean's magazine, a Canadian magazine, ran an excerpt and posted that chapter on their website. And I want people to read it. And I wanted also, I wanted to turn the book around relatively quickly, and modern publishing finds that more and more difficult to do. So the book is being released as an ebook. There is a paperback as well, and I'm hoping that the ebook is the way it functions as a kind of hardcover, so that the political population, people who are most interested, read it that way. They can read it rapidly, and then we'll see if there's a bigger public audience, and at that point we'll see maybe there'll be a more conventional model for this, but. It means I could bypass, I did this, my agent and I, represented by William Morris, they're trying this experiment with direct distribution of books, and we'll see how it works.
So nominally they are the publisher, William Morris, of the paperback?
The paperback is we hired a print-on-demand company, and the print-on-demand company then generates the paperback.
So the distribution of the paperback is through places like Amazon, or did you harness an actual
Amazon
store, a distribution system that gets things into stores?
Both. Amazon will you can buy the paperback from Amazon, and the paperback is then available to the book wholesalers, Ingram and others, so that if it begins to be successful, that booksellers can order copies of this book from Ingram and at a discounted rate, and then they will have them and be able to make the normal retailers markup.
So that is novel, but there is
we'll see whether it works.
But there's no free version of the whole thing electronically.
No.
Okay, no. I was under the mistaken
impression
that
what you got was an electronic galley, and people. So there was an early distribution to people in the media where they could go they get a password, they go to a site, they log in, and they could read. And the version you have has a number of typographical errors in it. It's uncorrected. So the version that is now downloadable from Amazon or that is available in paperback is not the thing I was holding up before was the unproofed. That's what you were reading. Is now the proofed version and the finished version.
Okay, great. Anything else you want to say about the whole enterprise?
I probably said too much.
Well, you hope so. That's good for sales. I recommend saying too much. I mean, at some point, according to the American Enterprise Institute, you must have said too much, but that's worked out okay.
Well,
and I would say, your influence is certainly not diminished. If anything, you seem to me more prominent since you left AEI. Maybe that's my imagination, but I think, the Frum Forum thing has worked out very well. I don't know if that existed before you left AEI, but it's a lot more high profile now if it did.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, I often say about the decade of the 2000s, this is one of the more traumatic decades in American. It's a decade that opened with Pearl Harbor, ended with the Great Crash, and had Vietnam in between. And if living through that doesn't have very powerful impacts on all of us, I don't know what will. And so that was a decade where we all underwent a lot, and and it certainly was as shaping for me as anything other than the other trauma of the years when I was young in the late 70s and early 1980s.
Okay. Well, thank you, David, for taking so much time.
Well,
and
authors do that. So thank you, Bob. I'm grateful to you.
I'm going to hold up the book again. If you hold up the book at the same time I do,
we'll have it in stereo.
Viewers will have no choice but to
Talismanic power. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Thank you very much. I'm great to talk to you. Bye-bye.
All right. See you, David.